Sure, and look at the source of that.
And do we recognize it then?
A subject I don't want to go into too deeply here, but the source of that is the so-called Judeo-Christian ethic, where you have a God of the Old Testament who, on the one hand, says love all your neighbors, and then turns right around and reverses that decree and says, destroy everybody and leave nothing breathing. So, how can you have a normal human culture where people care for each other and connect with each other when you have such a schizophrenic view?
Yeah.
Of the world? It's impossible.
Well, let me ask you this, Laura. If we are raised in this conditioned culture that's been designed by psychopaths, then how far away from having a conscience is the population at large?
Well, I would say that their conscience has been perverted. There are things called conversive thinking, paramoralisms, and so on. There's some extreme examples of what is paramoralistic behavior. Everybody knows that some things are moral and immoral. I mean, okay, let's take that as a given. And, for example, the abuse of children is considered by nearly all cultures to be immoral. Mm-hmm. And from time immemorial, sex with children, very small children, has been considered to be immoral. And yet, there are groups of people who can paramoralistically convince other groups of people that abusing a child is a good thing. For example, some cults that may talk about demon possession. Okay, so the child is behaving a certain way. Maybe the child has a psychological disorder. Maybe the child has a physical disorder. But the child acts in a certain way, maybe even is disobedient. And so the child is demon possessed, and they beat the child to death, and they justify this as being a moral action. Mm-hmm. And that is basically a paramoralism. Where you justify any ad hoc thing you want to do by giving it a moralistic explanation. And this is so typical of our society. Either you're with us or against us.
Right.
is a paramoralism. If you're against us, then you are with the terrorists. And that is so absurd a paramoralism that it hardly needs to be described, but there it is, and people believe in it because they understand, that things are moral or they're immoral, and a good psychopath can convince them that anything is moral. And there's even a more recent example. There was an article in the paper the other day that there are these groups that are now saying, they're now trying to convince society that sex with children is okay.
Yeah.
That it's good for them, that they like it.
The mainstream media conditions people to sort of accept evil as a regular, everyday thing. It's normal, that it's normal. And we see examples of this, too, in the alternative media, where people have actually told me we should embrace the bad guys along with the good guys, because all that really matters is that we unite to fight the New World Order. And my argument was, how can we fight the evil if we embrace the evil? Don't we become the evil if we embrace the evil?
Well, there's a problem there, too, and the problem is that if any group tries to go against a psychopathic, shall we say, organization, and they have within their own membership individuals who are subject to psychopathic manipulations, they will immediately fall into trouble, because those individuals who are subject to being paralyzed by the stare of the psychopath or by the scent of the psychopath, and who is subject to being converted by their paramoralisms or their conversive thinking, they will then begin to do what Lobachevsky calls ponerize the movement itself, and begin to shift it this way and that. And it's like a ship. If you set sail from, say, England, and you want to sail to Miami, and you're off course just a little bit, just like 1 or 2 degrees at the point of beginning, you may end up in New York, which is, very far from your destination. And the same thing happens with any kind of group. If there are people inside who are subject to these paramoralistic insinuations and conversive thinking, they can take that group and they can take it completely off course and almost unnoticeably.
Yeah, let's get into that conversive thinking. Now, we talked a lot on our show about hypocrisy and the hypocrites in the 9/11 truth movement, and we've written a lot of exposés that that point out people's hypocrisy, the so-called leaders of this truth movement. And it's interesting to also add to this that psychopaths tend to gravitate toward positions of power. They like to be the leaders and the spokesmen and the people who shape public perception and opinion. But this conversive thinking, we see evidence of this in certain spokespeople in the 9/11 movement too, don't we?
Oh, absolutely. And just for those who don't really know what conversive thinking is something that was highlighted during the so-called Cold War, the communist era. Conversive thinking is where it's a form of double talk,
right,
where words are used in a certain way, using terms but giving them opposing or twisted meanings. You know, for example, you use the term peacefulness, but you really mean appeasement, or vice versa. You can say appeasement, and you really mean peace. This
is what I wrote in my notes.
And freedom, for example, means license. We hear a lot of people who come on our forum, and when we do not permit certain behaviors, certain kinds of attacks, and twisting and manipulation, they say, that we are totalitarian. We do not, respect freedom of speech. Well, they don't really want freedom of speech. They want license to manipulate and twist and distort. So there's another one, traditional. Think of how the Bush administration referred to Europe, old Europe. The
right,
backward. Their traditional has come to mean backward. Such things as being efficient is referred to as being, micromanaging, small-mindedness.
Psychopaths use conversive thinking to generate fear and terror. So we can see that being used with the Bush regime. The media does it. We also see it in the 9/11 truth circles, where they block out uncomfortable conclusions and they substitute them for more convenient conclusions. But it's not truth, is it?
Yeah. Another one is something like extraordinary rendition. You love that one?
Yeah.
Extraordinary rendition. What it really means is to kidnap someone illegally and take them somewhere and torture them. And, when I was a kid, my grandmother would take pig fat and she would render it. This is where you cook it very slowly until all the fat comes out of the tissue, and then you have a liquid. So you think of rendition. I mean, they're using the word rendition. They're taking something and they're squeezing it till there's no juice left in it. And in this case, it's a human being. So, I mean, this kind of use of words is very sick. It's very sick, and it is very compelling because, the ordinary person who has not been well educated, and let's face it, in the United States, most people have not been well educated. The majority of people who graduate from high school in the U.S. are not even literate. So if you take somebody who has been deliberately dumbed down, and then you start playing with words in this way and saying, "Oh, it doesn't mean that; it means this." They're easy prey for that kind of manipulation. So an uneducated society, which has been deliberately made so, is ripe for the plucking by a gang of psychopaths.
It should be noted, too, that psychopaths can be very charming. They can be the guy next door. They don't necessarily look evil. They don't necessarily act evil overtly. They can be your neighbor. They can be a doctor. They can be a teacher. They can be a member of the clergy. They can be your friend around the corner. It's really hard to detect them unless you start informing yourself of the study of evil. And this all ties into the whole 9/11 truth and patriot community and the alternative media. An example of a person in our 9/11 truth movement, the so-called movement, who uses paramoralisms and conversive thinking is Eric Hufschmidt.
Oh, yeah. Hufschmidt is a real...
piece of work, isn't he?
Is a real piece of work, yes, indeed. And, for example, just one thing to keep in mind always is that psychopaths and schizoidal psychopaths, there are several types, in fact, and you would learn about all of this if you read Lobachevsky's book. they tend to accuse other people continuously, loudly, and rancorously of the very things they do themselves.
Exactly.
I mean, that's almost like a 100% rule. You can guarantee it every time.
Right. Well, and you pointed out that the cyber stalkers that have been harassing me did that also. The very things they accuse me of are the very things that they do. They accused me of being filthy and disgusting, but that's exactly what they are and what they do.
Yeah, they always accuse their victims of being, exactly what they are and what they do themselves.